Hey, I'm Dr. Gordo, and welcome to the Raven and the Writing Desk. Today we're taking a look at teaching executive function to students with communication needs. I'm going to talk about learning disabilities and communication needs, but the emphasis really is on communication needs in general. I'm going to look at how I address communication needs as part of my universal design for learning, and in order to tell you how I do all of this, we're going to talk about executive function instruction. First, what is a communication need? Something is preventing communication and intervention is required. In other words, a student cannot communicate effectively. We need to use technology or some other approach in order to meet that student's needs. What are learning disabilities? Simply put, it is a neurological issue that is preventing learning and is diagnosed by a medical professional, not a classroom teacher, not a parent, medical professional. Learning disabilities are divided into three broad categories: communication, such as dyslexia; behavioral, ADHD; and intellectual, such as Down syndrome. To be fair to each one of these categories, each one would need its own video. So for our purposes today, we're going to talk about how all learning disabilities present communication needs. A communication need is a barrier to effective communication. Another significant source of communication needs is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Now, we could spend hours talking about ASD, but for today, let's just say that ASD is something that's present at birth, diagnosed as a toddler. It's not in itself a learning disability. It is a neurological development disorder. It can present itself in the classroom as a communication need because autistic children can often miss nonverbal cues, misunderstand nuance, and miss figurative meaning. It's important to note that this is a spectrum. Not all autistic children will have communication needs, but many of them do. And what's more important is we get into combined diagnoses, complex cases. A student with ASD may also have a diagnosed learning disability, and so you've got to take care of both those needs. And the situation just continues to get more complicated because we can also bring mental health into the conversation about communication needs. If I have a student with a diagnosed major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, there's going to be barriers to effective communication. And the diagnoses keep coming. We can also talk about fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, FASD, not to be confused with ASD, and again, would need its whole other video. And all diagnoses aside, there are plenty of non-diagnoses that are going to prevent effective communication. If a child is getting inadequate sleep, diet, or exercise, that is going to impact the learning. At this point, you may be wondering, is there a child in my classroom who doesn't have a communication need? That's an excellent question, and none of this is easy. There's a very good reason why half of teachers don't make it to a second year of teaching, and the remaining, about 25%, will be gone by year 5. Others will get into administration and other roles outside of the classroom because none of this stuff is easy. But if you're a caring teacher and you want to figure it out, there is a way to get all of this done. In order to do all of this, we need to be in the right headspace. We need to say to ourselves, a child is not a diagnosis. We shouldn't be saying, I have an ADHD kid in my room, or I have lazy kids in my room. These labels don't help. What you can do is understand the diagnosis. When you have a student with a learning disability, read up on it. It's not going to give you a blueprint to that child, but it could give you some general guidelines on how you can put together your lesson plans to meet the communication needs. We must remember that the child isn't something to be fixed. There is a need to be met. And this video is not going to provide you with any easy answers because all I can say is learn to fail well. Learn that when you make mistakes, that no matter how much it stings, you're reflecting on the situation and what you're going to do next time to better meet the student's needs. In order to bring this all together, you can apply a Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. A UDL is a theoretical framework. It is the design of your learning space. Simply put, you are thinking, what is something I can do that benefits every student, but also really helps to meet the needs of the ones who really need their needs met? And so I am thinking about the whole classroom, how it comes together. A common example for UDL is there enough room in your classroom for a student with a wheelchair to get around? Because even if you don't have a student with a wheelchair, that added space would benefit students who need that space to move around. A lot of teachers hear that example and then assume, well, UDL is not for me because there's no one in a wheelchair at my school, or even if I did, I don't know how they'd fit in my classroom. My classroom is filled. I would hazard to guess if you were told that tomorrow you would have a student with a wheelchair starting in your room, you would find a way to make it work. So just to go along with this scenario, can I push desks to the side of the room so everybody has a chair, but maybe not everyone needs a desk? And maybe I can store those desks elsewhere. The point is, I'm going to create floor space to try to meet that student's needs. In short, I tend to think of UDL more as reflection than an actual thing that you do. It is thinking about the learning space and how you can make it better. When it comes to communication needs, how could I apply UDL? Well, I could have a visual auditory schedule in multiple places in the classroom. A copy of that schedule may need to be on certain students' desks, but I'm going to make sure that that is visible all over the room. And whenever I'm referring to something that's on the wall, I'm going to point to it to help the students make those connections. I'm going to be aware of any individual education plans in the room. I think in the States they call it a 504. In other words, the plan provides instructions for those who have been identified with a need. What can I do in the classroom to help them out? For example, they may have some talk-to-text technology, but here's the kicker. A lot of students with that technology don't like to use it because it makes them stand out. What I could do in my classroom early on, have a lesson where everybody's going to use talk-to-text, and then it normalizes it. Then going forward, all students can have that option, whether to type or do talk-to-text. I'm also a firm believer in rich assessment tasks. I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but the point is I'm going to try to connect with every student that shows up to the room, knowing that I'm not going to be successful with everybody, but I'm certainly going to give it my best try. An important part of my universal design for learning is to think about what I can control. As we've seen so far in the video, there are so many things that we don't have control over that prevent barriers to learning, and we can't get too pessimistic about all that. We need to focus on what we can control. So what can we control? We can show up for the people who show up. We can be present for our students. And yes, you need to smile, you need to be authentic. And while you're doing all of that, you're delivering the curriculum, you're teaching the content standards, and here in Ontario, teaching the learning skills is also an important part of education. When I am planning, I can figure out how to create engaging lessons that everyone's going to enjoy. I can model a healthy lifestyle. If I'm concerned that students are not getting proper diet, exercise, or sleep, I can certainly try to do that so they can see the benefits. And here is the big one. I need to prevent personal barriers, and that involves keeping identity in check. This part of the video is going to be a little difficult for some teachers to hear because identity is such a big part of their practice. Being trained in Ontario, it used to be a big part of my practice, but then I taught in Sweden. In Sweden, they don't like it when you talk about yourself, and if you're a stranger, they don't like it when you ask questions about them. They look at you as a teacher, and they just want you to teach. I got stubborn about it. I thought, no way Teachers College talk so much about anti-racism and decolonization without there being something to it. So I tried to keep applying it, and I kept failing. It got to the point where my administration moved me out of my classroom and put me into special education, which was my introduction to that subject. They strongly encouraged me to put identity aside and adopt a trauma-based approach. A trauma-informed approach takes into consideration that when I see that student in the classroom, I don't know what personal, intergenerational, or cultural trauma they bring into the class. I don't know what I could say that could trigger an episode, so I have to be very careful. What I do is I only collect data that is germane to my practices. I try to avoid personal questions, and again, I try to engage all students, get to know them, and then that is how I discover their communication needs. When I left Sweden and went back to Ontario, I went back to the identity-based pedagogy, and it was like I was back first year teaching. I was striking out with every student. Then I thought, well, why don't you try the trauma-informed approach? And it's worked a lot better, and I won't go back on it. Not that there is not criticism of the trauma-informed approach. I could do a whole video on that, but it's very good for establishing the difference between a safe space and a learning space. When a student is dysregulated and they can't partake in the classroom properly, there should be a space for them to go and practice emotional control. Within the learning space itself, students need to understand that they're going to hear new ideas. They're going to hear things that they disagree with, and we need to figure out how to all get along. In order to ensure that I have an effective learning space, I need to make sure that student expectations are clear. I am a big believer in free speech. I think it's an essential part of a democracy. No free speech, no social justice. And as a public school teacher, it is my job to promote good citizenship and foster lifelong learning. And so they need to know how free speech works. It is not saying whatever you want, whenever you want. It's for sharing truths. And the list of truths is quite short. Therefore, we don't need to be speaking that often when we can be listening. We listen to the opinion of others. We are willing to take in new evidence. And then when we do speak, we ensure that what we're saying is evidence-based. So you may ask, how do you maintain order in the classroom? Because surely people are hearing things they don't like to hear. Again, I focus on the content standards. I focus on the curriculum. There shouldn't be any conversations going on in the class that's not directly connected to the curriculum. So if I feel a conversation's going off the rails, I can bring students back to the curriculum. I do not have many rules in the classroom, but I don't allow catastrophizing. This is the source of a lot of anxiety, allowing students to talk about all the bad things that could happen. Well, we have limited time together, and what we're going to do, let's talk about all the good things that may happen. Today's the only day we ever know, and so I want students to focus on what they can do today and what they can control in their own lives. Again, let's not get taken down by what we can't control. Another classroom rule would be, generally speaking, no hate speech. Anything that is promoting hate needs to be shut down right away, teachable moment. However, there will be things said in the classroom that are evidence-based that students aren't going to agree with, and they may get really upset about it. So what do we do when that happens? We practice radical acceptance. This term comes out of discussion-based therapy, and it is what it sounds like. There's somebody with an evidence-based opinion different than your own. What are you going to do about it? You have to learn to accept it because, again, we share the learning space just like we share this country in a democracy. We all need to learn how to get along. And other little things I do in the classroom is avoid why questions. It's interesting. Every why question sounds at least a little bit accusatory. So when students are talking to one another, I'm encouraging them not to say, why do you think that? Why do you do that? Well, what reasons are you basing your beliefs on? How did you come to that conclusion? I just found that little minor change really smooth things out in classroom discussions. Now, I don't want to give the impression that all these things I have in place creates this stable, functioning classroom. It requires constant maintenance. And as much as I can talk about listening, radical acceptance, students are going to get upset over all sorts of things, particularly things that happen, again, outside the classroom that are beyond my control. So here it is. I have a student in front of me who is very upset, and I'm concerned that it could result in some behaviors. I am going to remember that feelings are first. There is no sense trying to reason with an upset child. What I need to do is get them to get their emotions under control, and this is where validation comes in. For those who don't know validation, here's a quick 101. It is not justifying the behavior. It is not agreeing with the person. It is simply telling them that their feelings are valid. So let's go through a little scenario. A student said something in front of the class that really wasn't backed by evidence, and a student corrected him. Some people laughed, and now I've got an embarrassed student. I can tell that student's upset. I'm going to go up to him, not going to ask him how he's doing. I know how he's doing. He's embarrassed. I can say, like, hey, bud, you look upset. Like, what's going on? Oh, well, and then listen to his version of events without correcting it. Ideally, if I get that student talking, they're going to come to the realization that you spoke in front of the class without evidence and you got burned for it. Lesson learned. If it doesn't get to that point, I am not going to suggest problem solving without the student's permission, because when we are upset, we want to be upset. We don't want to hear solutions. I would like the student to get to a point where I can ask, so would you like some problem solving, or do you want me to stick with validation? And then if that student wants problem solving, then I can make suggestions on how that could be avoided in the future. Moving along to assessment evaluation, I must be careful here because this is my area of expertise, and so I can go off on a major tangent. I just want to take a moment to point out the problem with traditional student products when it comes to communication needs. When I say student products, I'm talking about tests or essays. Let's think about a moment about what happens during a test. You as the teacher have to design it, prepare students for it, probably have a whole period dedicated to administering the test, then you got to mark the test, then you hand back the test whenever. And this could all result in weeks worth of work. If you have students with communication needs in the room, you may have test anxiety. You'll have students skipping that test. So how do you make up for that assessment? Or we can get into essays. A tremendous amount of time goes into marking essays. In Ontario, for quite some time now, teachers have been told that student products should be maybe a third of your assessment. The other 2/3 are conversations and observations, which a lot of teachers don't seem to know how to do properly. If you'd like me to do a video on how to bring in conversations in the classroom, I can do that, but I can tell you that when you focus on conversation, you're going to have an easier time creating student-centered approaches. You're also going to find you're going to learn a lot about what the students know. If you get really effective at communication, a test becomes unnecessary because I already know what you know. I have a pretty good idea of what you're going to get on the test, so let's focus on conversation. I'll leave student assessment there so we can get on to your own assessment, your success criteria. How do you know you're being successful in the classroom? You've put all this time and effort into your UDL. You've got your goals in mind. How do you know it's working? Especially in the classroom, we can get theory blindness. We don't understand or we don't see that we're doing something that's not working. I find when teachers have too abstract of a UDL, they're going to have trouble determining tangible goals. So for example, what's your UDL? What's your goal in the classroom? I want everyone to feel safe. Oh, fantastic. How do you know if you're being successful? Well, halfway, 3/4 through the semester, if I feel people are looking comfortable, I think everybody's safe. You're waiting until 3/4 in the semester to determine if you're successful or not. You need to have tangible success criteria much easier in the semester. And what does that even mean? Keep everybody safe. So if one student comes forward and says, I don't feel safe in this room, does that mean your UDL is a failure? Or are you okay with not everybody feeling safe in the room? When you hear that out loud, it's like, okay, I better focus something more tangible, something that I can actually see. In my UDL, I am interested in improving cognitive skills. That goes hand in hand with the free speech. All my lessons have that in mind. But how do I know I'm being successful? How do I know that cognitive skills are being developed? I am going to look for evidence of independent thought, of making good decisions, and my favorite, intrinsic motivation. If I see that, I know that I've done a good job as a teacher. And recently, I discovered an excellent way that I can improve my students' cognitive skills with direct instruction on executive function. So what is executive function? Executive function is the brain's ability to plan, focus, remember, and self-regulate. It is not fully developed until we're in our 20s, which explains why most adolescents procrastinate, lack organization, have forgetfulness, inability to follow instructions, impulsivity, rigid thinking, and poor goal setting. You thought they were just lazy? No, they're developing their executive function. To put this into context, let's not think a 24-year-old is forgetful, turns 25, all of a sudden executive function fully developed, everything's okay. We all have varying executive function skills. But when it comes to children, remember that this part of their brain is still developing. So yes, he really did forget the classroom rule that you've been doing all along. What has me excited about executive function is its connection to communication needs. If a student has a communication learning disorder, it's probably in the frontal lobe of the brain, the same area that contains our executive function. And I'm not a brain researcher. I have a rather qualitative understanding of it all, so I hope you don't challenge me on any of this. I would just like to move along by pointing out that that is something every student has in common. They are all developing their executive function, so therefore, if I make executive function instruction part of my UDL, it's something that's going to benefit all students. So on the screen, you're going to see two lists of words. On the right are the 6 Ontario learning skills: responsibility, organization, independent work, collaboration, initiative, and self-regulation. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have the executive functions: response inhibition, working memory, emotional, flexibility, sustained attention, task initiation, planning, prioritizing, organization, time management, goal-directed persistence, and metacognition. In a side-by-side comparison, we can see that the learning skills are effectively executive function skills. But why bother teach executive function if the learning skills are going to take care of it? As you can see on this slide, concepts like self-regulation, described as impulse control, emotional self-regulation, and reflection, it's easier to use those terms. If you say a student needs to improve self-regulation, what exactly do you mean? Executive function gives you a wider vocabulary to meet student needs. There are many ways you can incorporate executive function into your curriculum, regardless what you're teaching, all sorts of many lessons. I put some examples up here on the screen. We can talk about communicating feelings. We can talk about multiple ways to solve a problem. We can talk about turn taking. When we're putting together projects, we can have conversations about, well, how do you plan? How do you organize all this information? There's many wonderful student-centered approaches to teaching executive function. It's also good to note that if your class is completely unfamiliar with executive function terms, you can start fresh with them. It can start as simple as having an executive function survey, introduce the topic to the students, and I'll show you that survey in a moment. I'm also going to have the vocabulary of executive function words up on the wall, so when I am explaining things, I'm conscious that I'm using those terms, pointing it to the wall, helping students make those connections. I need to make sure I have multiple explanations because the first go, probably not get through to them. My assessment and evaluation will also be using the vocabulary, again, just to solidify the concept. There's a link to this survey in the description. What I like about it is it asks judgment-free, cultural neutral questions to determine where people are in their executive function, at least today. And this is something personal you can share with students. I can show them, wow, my response inhibition could be a lot better. I am way too blunt with people. Also, when you take a look at the state of my desk, I need help with organization. The good news is, as we can see, there's several scores there that are really good. I can use those skills to help in areas where I know I have weakness. And as I strengthen those skills, the skills that are already strong become stronger. In lieu of giving your students a survey that asks them personal questions, consider this survey. I think you'll get much better insight to where they are as learners. To bring this all together, let's go through a lesson scenario, and let's remember that this is a scenario I created for which I have the solution. So I know not a whole lot of learning can come out of a scenario. Let's just say I'm in Ontario and I'm teaching a grade 12 English class. These students are off to university next year. In university, they need to be really good at essay writing, and I'm also aware that AI is a tool of the future. They're going to be using it. Let's learn how to use it properly. So I'm putting together a jigsaw. If you're not familiar with a jigsaw, you put students into groups and they focus on one topic. They become experts on that topic. You then reorganize the students so at least one person from each of those groups forms a new group. They share what they discussed in the expert group, in the discussion group, and then ideally everybody at the end has a little piece of everything. In this scenario, we're continuing with our work on essay writing. We've used AI before. There's no new skill being practiced in this lesson. So students are coming in the room. I'm greeting them at the door as part of my whole rapport building efforts. And they come in, I'm directing them to their expert groups. They all have access to the same essay. The essay is factually correct, but doesn't have any sources in it. So I am asking them to apply AI and find quality sources that would suit the argument of the paper. Also, the paragraphs are written a little rough, so after you've done finding some sources, get work on doing some editing. Then when you go into the discussion groups, you can talk about what you did with the essay in the hopes that at the end, the class has the perfect essay. But of course, there is a problem. Despite my best efforts to keep people on track, I find they're chatting more than fact-finding. They're not looking up sources. I'm finding that the groups did find a couple sources, but they're the same. I'm also finding that people who are editing, they're kind of doing it to themselves. They're not sharing what exactly is that they're doing. In other words, I'm feeling that when they go to the discussion group, it's not going to work. They're not going to have anything new to discuss. So what am I going to do in this scenario? I can think of two common solutions that do not work. The one solution would be to reduce the number of expectations. Okay, everyone, I told you to find X number of sources, but now find Y number of sources. And don't worry about doing any editing. We need to make sure we got the sources for the discussion group. If the students have had trouble finding good sources up to this point, what does me reducing the expectations change? If anything, it just teaches the students that if you drag your heels in life, people will think less of you and then not expect much out of you. Another assumption is, oh, I really didn't give them enough time to find these sources. How about we just stay in the expert groups today and then tomorrow we do the discussion? Well, I've already got things for tomorrow planned. If I set a realistic goal for my students as part of executive function, I need to show them that we need to work through obstacles to meet realistic goals. In my classroom, I try to avoid speaking to the whole class as little as possible. I'm very much one-on-one, small group, but in this case, I've got to draw attention to myself and I have to tell people what I am seeing. I can say, well, I'm going around, I see people chatting, but they don't seem to be chatting about the sources, and I'm worried that editing is not getting done, and frankly, when we go to the discussion groups, you're not going to have anything to discuss. So help me understand what is going on. What is preventing you from accomplishing the task? Do you not have enough time? Is the planning and prioritizing off? Are you having trouble getting going on the task? Get feedback from the students. The students figure out what the obstacle is, figure out the problem, and we continue through. So to recap executive function in the classroom, we want to make sure that we're working towards our goal. We're not reducing expectations in order to meet that goal. And we are practicing a culture of classroom success. We encourage each other. We may not get it now, but we're going to get it. We're applying that growth mindset. But it doesn't come easy. As the teacher, I need to make sure that my instructions are as clear as possible and that those instructions are being communicated clearly. And again, how do I know I'm being clear? What evidence do I have in front of me that what I am doing is actually working? In summary, it's important to remember that communication needs are case by case. That's why we need to get to know individual students in order to inform our UDL so we can move towards tangible goals. We're going to focus on what we can control, and we're going to focus on developing executive function skills. It's also really important to ensure that we're free to change our mind. When new evidence come in, we should feel free to challenge our beliefs on what we're doing in the classroom and always be open to trying something new. To recap some next steps, I would encourage everyone to look into the trauma-informed approach. I would encourage everyone to ensure you know about validation, learn how you can apply conversations to your assessment, and remember the power of executive function instruction. I really appreciate your time watching the video today. I hope it was worth your while. I have the survey down in the description, and as we go out, I'll make sure you see my bibliography. Have a great day. Bye.